Today we're going to be talking about science fiction books that you can read if you're interested in philosophy. I like to just call this philosophical science fiction. I've talked about this a couple of times before, and I want to expand the boundaries a little bit and also talk about a few fantasy books and series that you could read that I think do a good job of exploring philosophical themes. If this is the first time you've seen me talk about this subject on my channel, well, I'm going to point you down to a couple of videos down below where I've talked about other books. If there are books that you're expecting to see in a video like this, but you don't see, well, they might have been mentioned previously. But as always, I want to hear other suggestions from you, and if there are books you'd like me to discuss in the future, please let me know down below. Oh, and one other note, since I am expanding the remit of this to also talk about fantasy, there's a natural question that's going to come up, which is what about things like magical realism, which clearly can have a philosophical character to them. I'm thinking of the works of Borges or Rushdie or Gabriel Garcia Marquez. I won't be talking about magical realism in a video like this, though I think in the future it would make sense to do a video about the philosophical themes found in magical realism. If you'd like to see me talk about that, let me know down below. The first series that I want to talk about is the Sun Eater series by Christopher Rocchio. There are currently 5 books in this series. It is ongoing. I know that some people are hesitant to read series that aren't complete because they feel like they've been burned by authors before, but I can say this. Christopher, who I talk to sometimes, he's a good guy. He is a dedicated writer and he is working really hard. The 6th book is on its way to being published. It's going to be published early next year. And the 7th book, which should be the final book in the series, is currently being written. And I have no doubt that he is going to be able to finish it in a timely fashion. He's also written a bunch of novellas and short story collections that are all tied into this universe. So if you do fall in love with it like I have, there's just so much that you are going to be able to read. It is science fiction, but it has heavy fantasy elements, and so a lot of people call it a science fantasy, but it's also a space opera. But when we're talking about the philosophical themes of this book, I think that the number one theme that Rocchio is trying to explore is what does it mean to be a human being? Just so you know, I won't be spoiling this book or any of the other books, but I will talk about some of the themes and maybe light mentions of plot. You've been warned. The main character in this series is a guy named Hadrian Marlowe, who is a member of this kind of elite class that rules the universe. There is an empire that has spread across various planetary systems, and it's ruled by a genetically modified elite. But this is also an elite which, due to their kind of religious superstitions, are very against any kind of technology that emulates human sentience, and they're very against certain kinds of bioengineering or the blending of human beings and machines. And one of the tensions that comes up over and over and over again in this series is whether or not this is a consistent position to have. Hadrian is someone who has to wonder how human he really is, given that he was genetically modified from before he was born, and he was actually grown in a tank in order to be this kind of excellent specimen. And yet he still looks down on creatures that have been more genetically modified than he, or people who choose to enhance themselves with technology. This is made all the more relevant because in the background of so much of the Sun Eater series is an intergalactic battle between a new kind of species called the Silson. At least I think that's how you say it. I've never had to say it out loud before. And so while Hadrian has to wonder about what it means for him to be a human being, he also has to wonder about the moral considerations that he owes to clearly non-human creatures. I have just completely fallen in love with this series of books. I can't wait to finish it, but I also can't wait to see whatever Christopher Rocchio comes up with next, because I think that this is a science fiction author who just has like a very bright future. So many of us that love science fiction and fantasy, we love those big series because we can dig in deep and it will give us tens or even hundreds of hours of reading enjoyment. But I'm also a real fan of really solid standalones, and that's why I want to talk about Babel 17 by Samuel Delany. Samuel Delany is a part of the science fiction new wave. He is sort of a peer of my favorite science fiction writer, Ursula K. Le Guin. Babel 17 is a short, tightly written, very fast-paced philosophical novel. It still has plenty of deep moments, though, and it's really a rich read. In particular, Delany is exploring the relationship between language and thought. Now, this is a common enough theme that you see in science fiction. A lot of people have been inspired by something that's called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which is this idea that the language you speak actually shapes how you cognize the world or how you make sense of it, because it shapes the concepts that you have. I don't think that the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is taken that seriously in either philosophy or psychology anymore. However, even if the particular empirical claims that Sapir and Whorf were making are not maybe validated in the lab, there is still something kind of important there that Delaney is trying to express. Imagine, for instance, if there was a language that lacked the first person pronoun, and so you were unable to talk about yourself in this special and immediate way that, say, speakers of English can. Does this change the relationship that you have to yourself? And particularly, does it change the way that you view yourself in relation to other people? Because in some ways, if you don't have that first person pronoun, you're speaking about everybody on equal footing. This is explored in a single moment in Babel 17, and yet the dialogue that takes place there with the main character and this person who speaks a kind of broken language really epitomizes all of the things that are being explored by Samuel Delaney. But let's talk about our first work of fantasy in a video like this, and that's A Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula K. Le Guin. If you have seen my video about Ursula K. Le Guin, you know some of my thoughts about Earthsea, but also if you have seen my top 10 fantasy books, then you know that A Wizard of Earthsea is one of my favorite fantasy series of all time. You know, I'm such a big Ursula K. Le Guin fan that it's very easy for me to sort of overlook A Wizard of Earthsea, actually, because there's so much in the science fiction realm that I love. And that's why when I did my very first video on philosophical science fiction, I talked about Le Guin, but I only talked about her Hainish novels, like The Dispossessed and The Left Hand of Darkness. And truth be told, when many of us are thinking about philosophical novels, we think about literary fiction and we think about science fiction, but we don't really think about fantasy as a place where those kinds of ideas could be explored. I don't know exactly why science fiction is more prone to exploring philosophical ideas. It just does seem to be the way that history has played out. But in a series like A Wizard of Earthsea, you see Le Guin still bringing those big ideas to the page. Let's focus just on the first book in the series for our little discussion. I think one of the big influences on A Wizard of Earthsea was Jungian psychology. This is not actually me going out on much of a limb. You can hear Le Guin talk about Jung at various points in her career. Now, she eventually became more critical of Jung, kind of moved past his ideas, but especially early on, I think she found them very insightful, and she tried to incorporate ideas into all of her novels. And I believe that when she was writing A Wizard of Earthsea, she was really thinking about that concept of the shadow self. This is a part of our personality that does not correspond to our ideal. These are the parts of ourselves that we are ashamed of, that we try to repress. And without giving away too much of the specifics of A Wizard of Earthsea, though I would say honestly it's a book that can't really be spoiled, because even if you knew the ending, the book would be just as enriching when you read it. But still, one of the key things that Ged, the main character in A Wizard of Earthsea, has to acknowledge is his own shadow self. And it's a great example of really where, in order to defeat the kind of major evil that has been unleashed into the world, like we see in so many different fantasy series, the main character actually first has to come to terms with himself or herself. I know that Jungian psychology has become oddly popular again on YouTube. You can see people talking about it on philosophy channels. Also, partly that's probably due to the influence of Jordan Peterson, though not exclusively. If you were someone who was drawn to the idea of Jungian psychology or thinking about the shadow self or any of that, then A Wizard of Earthsea just is the book that I would recommend for you if you're also looking to read a bit in genre fiction. So now that we spent some time going through the galaxy with the Sun Eater series and Babel 17 and going through this wizardly magical archipelago in A Wizard of Earthsea, I want to take us back and talk about something a little bit more down to earth, and that is today's sponsor, NordVPN. Look, I'm talking to you about NordVPN because I think that internet privacy and taking care of yourself online is actually very important. And NordVPN is on a mission to make the internet better than it is today. This is an internet that's free from online threats, censorship, and surveillance. One of the ways that they do this is by offering their VPN service, which provides you with a layer of security as you browse the web. But NordVPN also offers a password manager and encrypted cloud storage if those services also interest you. Right now, NordVPN is offering a Black Friday deal. You can sign up for their 2-year plan and you can save 65%, and you can get an additional 4 months for free. All you have to do is use the link that's down below. I've also put it up on the screen, and you will have access to that deal. And so use that link down below, save that 65% off, get those 4 months free, and start browsing a little bit safer on the web. Thank you again to NordVPN for sponsoring this video. The next book I want to talk about is This Is How You Lose the Time War by Amal El-Mohtar and Max Gladstone. This obviously has a philosophical dimension to it because it is a time travel story. And this opens up questions about, one, whether or not time travel is actually even possible, but also the way that causality works in a world where you can go back in time and change things. El-Mohtar and Gladstone are trying to tell more of a romance or kind of very personal love story in their novel, and they do a great job of it. It's a very compelling read. And so what they end up doing is employing metaphors about threads in order to help us understand the way that different timelines can work and the way that you have to move up and down threads in order to change things, providing us with a nice kind of visual or tactile metaphor to give us a bit of an intuitive grasp on what really is a pretty heady subject. I feel like time travel is one of those topics that so many of us think about at least a little bit. Then we kind of dismiss it as this theoretical impossibility. You might be kind of surprised to find out that there are pretty serious philosophers who spent a long time wondering about whether or not time travel was even logically possible. Like, was it a paradox? Could it lead to paradoxes? I mean, all kinds of really interesting stuff happens here. And just thinking through the mechanics of time travel actually is the first step in order to be able to think philosophically about it. Next, I want to talk about Ender's Game and Speaker of the Dead by Orson Scott Card. I understand that there's a whole larger series in the Ender universe. I think there are 5 books that are kind of the main books of the Ender story, and then there are all these like shadow books and all of this other stuff. I mean, Orson Scott Card knew he had a good idea and a good universe, and he milked it for all it was worth. I'm only going to talk about the first 2 books for 2 reasons. One, I think the first 2 books are very good. They're very compelling on their own, and so they kind of form a nice unit. The second reason is I never finished the 3rd book. I think I started it and just didn't care about it all that much, and I'm not quite sure why, because I did particularly love Speaker of the Dead. So Ender's Game is, of course, this famous book about young children who are raised in a place called like Battle School. I mean, they're being raised in a military academy essentially in order to become great military commanders. And this centers around a potential sort of genius military commander of Ender Wiggins. And at first you might just think that all of the philosophical content of these novels is going to be kind of ethical stuff about whether or not it's okay in you might be wondering about whether or not it's morally permissible to raise children in this way or to wage a war in this way, especially if you're facing some kind of existential threat. Obviously, existential threats sort of change the moral calculus. However, it would be less interesting if that were just it, because every novel that has stakes or has conflict raises ethical questions, and if that were the standard for a philosophical novel, well then it would seem like every novel is almost by definition philosophical. But what ends up being a big theme here, it's similar to what we see in the Sun Eater series that I talked about at the beginning of this video, which is how much of a moral responsibility do we have to creatures who are very different from us? In particular, these kinds of creatures who conceptualize the world so differently that they might not even recognize us as sentient beings which are deserving of moral consideration. So often when we think about space travel stories, we tend to populate the worlds with creatures that are a lot like humans. Even if they don't look like humans, they still think like humans, and that makes things really simple. But actually, Orson Scott Card doesn't do that. He fills his universe with creatures and species who are very unlike us, and thus think of the world in very different terms, and thus when we have ethical disputes with them, when we have real disputes that actually really matter, they become really difficult to adjudicate in terms that both sides would be able to understand. The first novel does not talk about this very much until basically the very end, and then you have maybe that last 20 pages or so of Ender's Game, which is just devastating. It is just absolutely devastating. And then you get Speaker of the Dead, where Ender is essentially, and that theme that is heavily established in the last 20 or so pages of Ender's Game becomes the main theme of the second book. And that is why, in my opinion, the second book, Speaker of the Dead, is head and shoulders better than Ender's Game. I think Ender's Game is compelling, but ultimately just okay. Speaker of the Dead, on the other hand, ends up being an absolutely terrific philosophical science fiction novel. The philosopher Peter Singer sometimes talks about this idea of the moral circle. This is where we extend our moral consideration. The egoist says that it's just us, and then other people say it's us and our families. Some people put it in terms of race or general location or nationality or ethnicity, or they try to extend it all the way to all of humanity. But we reach a really difficult point when we wonder how far it needs to expand beyond humanity and in what capacity. And this is something that Orson Scott Card handles in a way that's really empathetic, that it actually makes you empathize with these creatures who are very unlike us, which might be the first thing that we have to overcome when we're trying to expand our moral circle. How do we empathize with other people who are unlike us or other creatures who are very unlike us? Okay, so let's talk about a fantasy series that does a great job of incorporating many philosophical themes into it, and that is Malazan, Book of the Fallen by Steven Erikson. Now, Malazan Book of the Fallen is just one of the book series that makes up this larger universe that's all about Malazan that Steven Erikson has also written with his writing partner, Ian Esselman. I believe they have both written different series. I have only read in Malazan Book of the Fallen, and I haven't finished Malazan Book of the Fallen, just as a warning. So maybe don't ruin that for me down in the comments. But I've read enough of the series to see that some themes are starting to emerge that certainly pique my interest as someone looking for those philosophical themes. One of those major themes that you find in Malazan Book of the Fallen actually is the problem of history. So much of this story is about what we remember and what we've forgotten, the way that the stories that we tell about ourselves, about our culture, can undergo permutations and changes through time, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally, and the sort of obligation that we have actually still to the truth. In the second novel, there are multiple characters actually who are historians by trade. One of them has been punished for speaking the truth rather than spreading propaganda, and another of them has to witness firsthand great tragedies, and sort of has this obligation, because he is a historian, to put himself there to actually document the horrendous things that are happening. So what we get in Malazan Book of the Fallen ends up being not just a story, but a story about the stories that we tell ourselves. And wondering, especially as we think of ourselves as storytelling beings, but also as the cultures we inhabit, as partly being made up by the kind of myths or stories that we endorse about our group. This is the thing that Erikson is turning his critical eye toward and making you look at it in the face throughout the entire series. The story does grip you because it's full of these grand creatures and gods and old gods and new gods and all this complicated magic, and you never quite know what's going on, and it's hard and difficult, and everyone likes to talk about how hard and difficult it is. But I think it's these deeper themes that Erikson is incorporating in his work that actually make the series really shine. And that's kind of the hallmark, I would say, of philosophical fiction. It's this ability to tell a good story while not neglecting and, in fact, emphasizing those deeper themes. You should be left wondering and thinking more once you've finished a novel like this.